Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Who Needs College Anymore? I would like to start by introducing Molly Cerrone, who is the acquisitions editor at Harvard Education Press.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayanne. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this Harvard Education Press book talk. I'm Molly Cerrone. I am an acquisitions editor at HEP. And today I'm delighted to introduce you all to Kathleen deLaski, the author of Who Needs College Anymore? Imagining a Future Where Degrees Won't Matter, which is part of HEP's Work and Learning series. Kathleen has extensive experience in higher education and education reform. She has founded or co-founded 4 nonprofits over the last 2 decades, all related to improving the quality of education for non-elite students. The Education Design Lab is one of them. It's an organization that identifies gaps in the education to work ecosystem, and it connects partners, funders, and colleges to create solutions together. The lab has supported around 125 colleges, as well as employers, high school districts, and regions, all in their move to a more skills-based economy. Kathleen currently serves as board chair of the Education Design Lab. She's also a senior advisor to the Project on Workforce at Harvard University and teaches human-centered design and higher ed reform at George Mason University. Before transitioning to the world of education, Kathleen actually spent the first half of her career as a journalist, including time as an ABC News White House correspondent, which I think is part of what makes her storytelling and the interviews in this book so engaging and wonderful. It's also an honor to introduce our moderator for today's book talk. Please welcome Robert B. Schwartz, Professor Emeritus of Practice in Educational Policy and Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Schwartz has held a variety of leadership positions in education and government over the course of his career. Currently, he co-leads the Pathways to Prosperity Network and is a senior advisor to the Harvard Project on Workforce. He's also contributed to or edited numerous Harvard Education Press volumes, and he co-edits the Press's Work and Learning series of books. Now, I'm happy to turn it over to Bob and let him kick off the conversation with Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Molly. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to introduce this wonderful book. I'm going to exercise the kind of moderator's privilege for a minute and create my own sense of the context for this book. In 2011, with 2 colleagues at Harvard, I put out a report, or we put out a report called Pathways to Prosperity. And in that report, we challenged the growing movement, if you will, of college for all, the notion that, everybody was going to get a 4-year college degree, move into the middle class and live happily ever after. And we kind of debunked that using a variety of kind of data sources, saying that's a nice vision, but simply not feasible. And what we really needed, we argued, was a kind of multiple pathway strategy. We needed to build another set of routes into our economy alongside the predominant kind of, 4-year college pathway. And we both challenged some of the economists who at the time were arguing that, the middle was hollowing out of our economy, and we were only going to have 2 kinds of jobs. Good jobs for those that would require at least a 4-year degree or more, and that everybody else is going to be consigned to low-wage, low-skill work. We challenged that and argued, and I think correctly, that although middle-skill jobs today look very different than they did, 50 years ago, there's still going to be lots of good jobs requiring at least a high school education, but something beyond, but not necessarily a 4-year degree. And we pointed to outside the US, we said there are lots of other countries that have figured this out, particularly in, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, that had built out systems, the best of them with a really strong apprenticeship model that, in the case of Switzerland, for example, serves 70% of kids and gives them the kind of support they need to take control of their own work life and their own kind of development, their own transition from adolescence to adulthood. In any event, we then, a year later, with my wife and colleagues at Jobs for the Future, we started this Pathways to Prosperity Network. The first book in the Work and Learning series was a kind of 5-year report, if you will, on the progress of the Pathways Network. And we got to a point, I think, where we understood 2 things. One was, although this work started under this sort of umbrella of high school reform, we really needed to bring post-secondary education into this in a much more serious way. And, the kind of mantra we developed was, um, rather than thinking about college for all, we weren't able to come up with a nice, easy phrase to describe what's going to replace college for all. But our phrase was, get everybody to a first post-secondary credential with value in the labor market. And the question is, what would a world look like in which that were actually to happen? And along comes Kathleen deLaski, a decade or more later. And as I read her book, it really is the most serious and thoughtful and provocative attempt I've seen to really sketch out a new vision for what this world would look like, where there really were significant alternative pathways from the end of compulsory education into the labor market, putting people on a path to good jobs where you could, in fact, ultimately get a living wage and ultimately support a family. So that's, for me, is the context here. I don't know whether you would accept that view, Kathleen, but basically, kind of what led you, why this book? What made you decide that you wanted to take on this challenge?
Well, I love your setup, Bob, and I should say for our audience that you are the reason that I actually made the leap to write a book. I mean, even though I was in journalism for many years, I kind of left that behind and thought of myself as a full-on education reform and social entrepreneur. But it was really this. I think it started to hit me that all the different pieces of my career, as I was stepping out of the CEO role of the lab 2-3 years ago, and we had coffee or lunch somewhere, and you said, well, you could write a book, because I said I'd love to write a book, but I wouldn't even know, the whole idea of publishing a book seemed arcane and sort of behind some hidden curtain. And so you actually kind of showed me how to, pull back the curtain and get to the right people. So thank you for that. The reason I wrote the book really is that there were two pieces that were just, I just felt like had to come out in terms of my own storytelling. And one of them was this idea that we have these two narratives. You alluded to it, and in my own family, it caused a lot of emotional and physical pain for my kids going through the gauntlet, the get into the best college you can gauntlet. And then in the work that I did, even dating back to when I was a journalist, but particularly in the last 12 years, the Education Design Lab has been working with the group of learners that we call new majority learners, so the people for whom college was not designed. And in looking at what their needs, many of them, as much as we can say college for all, and that's a totally noble pursuit, the degree model, particularly the 4-year degree model, was not working out for them. And data began to show, since the time that you started the Pathways Network, that yes, we were increasing outcomes or entry into college for more and more learners of color, learners from low income families, first in family, but we also have 40 to 50% of folks that try the gauntlet and it's not working out. And so this fact that 62% of Americans do not hold a 4-year degree, and yet we say you have to have a degree to get a good job. I mean, that just, for me, that was just painful to watch so many people, try or feel like they couldn't try for reasons of confidence or no childcare or transportation, and to have them feel, consigned to the wrong side of the economic divide. That led me to, make the argument, trying to use data and doing, 150 interviews from my, journalistic sense, that we have to elevate the other pathways, and that there's a fairness issue here around who gets funding, who gets dignity, that as you say, does not exist, does not happen in other countries. And so I wanted to highlight that story. And then at the same time, because my unit of change in starting the lab is the college, and the university, right? So I also wanted to kind of highlight the colleges that are starting to figure out how to think about a broader definition of college. How can they actually be the, kind of the winners in this new, this kind of changing world, and become, as you say in your book, the economic engines in their regions? Because if they don't own kind of this shift that learners and technology are kind of demanding, and employers, many colleges will fall by the wayside, not the elites, but many others. And so so the second reason for writing the book, besides elevating the other pathways, is to sort of help colleges think about how to shift to win.
One of the things that's interesting to me about this book is its structure. And you, coming from the design lab and this belief in kind of human-centered design thinking and putting the user first, you might say a word about kind of how you structured the book and who are your four users really.
Right. Yeah, and the lab
you've alluded
is
to one of them.
yeah,
college.
exactly. The lab is designed, or is the methodology of the lab is human-centered design, and I now teach human-centered design at George Mason University here in Virginia. So the idea, behind human-centered design is that you have to focus on the needs, particularly for a system or a product that isn't working. You focus on the needs of the end user, and you look at, okay, what's not working for them, and what are their behaviors, what are their motivations, sort of get underneath the topic or the issue, and try to start to prototype and test either workarounds or solutions. So I looked at each of the stakeholders, with, of course, the end user, the learner, being the most important, and looked at what workarounds, like what are, early adapters of a new, sort of the let's call it the new age of learning, that we're headed towards in mid-century. What are early adopter learners doing to kind of hack the college degree, if you will? And what are employers? So the second, in our construct of the end user being the most important, the second most important user in the higher ed construct is the employer, right? Because they're the sort of the other side of the market making that has to happen. And so I look at what are early adopter or more desperate, talent shortage employers doing, and then we look at high school guidance counselors, because they're facilitators in this. We go to the front lines of high schools and look at how they're adapting. And, and importantly, we look at what early adopter colleges are doing, that are thinking, okay, and I start out the chapter on colleges by sort of dismissing the elites, as you said, because, we said that, I did a calculation that said, if you accept fewer than 20% of your applicants, then you get put in the elite category. And I make the point that that's only 2% of college student seats in America. So let's put them aside. They're in great shape. The applications have never been higher. Elite brands reign in fashion and in higher education. And so, but what about everybody else? Because that's where most students go to college. So I do a chapter on non-elite colleges, and then end up kind of using, so design principles is the other thing that in human-centered design that you create, like sort of what must be true guardrails for your kind of new design or your new environment that you're trying to create based on the needs of the users. And then so I at the end I summarize from each of the chapters the design principles. So I end up with 10 that kind of frame and start off the last chapter, which is called The Great College Reset.
Yeah, we'll get to those a bit later. But when I look at the subtitle of the book, Imagining a Future Where Degrees Won't Matter, I mean, obviously one of the central questions, in a sense, or themes of this book is, well, how do we move to more skills-based hiring? And while there's a lot of, you can point to, for example, the number of states, it must be nearly half by now, where
It is.
either governors or legislatures have decided that for state employment, they're going to waive the degree requirement. And we've got some evidence from Maryland, which is the first adopter already, that's had, a discernible effect, changing the profile of who comes into state employment. We've got a handful, at least, of leading employers who've made the same pledge. And we've got certainly a couple of leading examples. I think about IBM, which in a 5-year period has gone from 90% of its job postings requiring a 4-year degree down to 50%. And they've done a lot of things internally to actually realize, make significant changes. But as you acknowledge, there's still there are a lot of problems to be addressed before we can get to scale. And it seems to me some of the most interesting things in this book are some of the examples of work going on to deal with one or another piece of this problem. One thing that intrigued me is the skills wallet. And you might say a word about that, and also about if you ask people to nominate what are the 2 states that are making the most progress on at least one piece of this agenda. I don't think most people would instinctively go to North Dakota and Alabama. Neither have been known as kind of pace setters in education or employment reform, but Kathleen, good journalist that you are, you found these places. So talk a bit about what they're doing and about the skills wallet strategy more generally.
Yeah, well, the idea of the skills wallet is, if you think about the wallets, the digital wallets we have today, it'd basically be, you're like, I'm taking a flight later today, and my flight is in my wallet. So I argue that within 5, maybe 10 at the outside, depends on other, extenuating factors, but within 5 or 10 years, we should be in a situation where you would have your skills in a wallet. So think of your resume in a constantly updating AI-inspired format, right, where you could organize your skills by different either jobs that interest you, and your wallet could do the match for you, or it can also be the foundation and the data for a like a GPS system, if you think about you enter in a career destination. I use the example of a car designer, that a young man that I met in Denver wanted to be a car designer, but he had no idea how to get there. He thought he should maybe go to trade school to be a car designer. And the question is, how would AI help him, and how would the skills wallet help him navigate there? So there are a couple of initiatives. There are a lot of initiatives going on. I mean, there's probably like 50 groups around the country working on and a lot of it's springing out of the if anyone in the audience is familiar with the LER movement, the Learning Employment Records, which is sort of born of the idea that let's make transcripts digital, both your high school transcript and your college transcript, so that you would have ownership and agency over that, and you can take it with you as you transfer around to different internships or colleges or high schools. You would be able to have all this in one place. So that's kind of where it started. And states like North Dakota is actually the first state that is going to have a wallet, a skills wallet for every graduating high school senior from public school. And so, that's sort of the idea that you kind of learn early how to begin to think about having ownership over your skills and the information that can tell you where you need to go from here. And the reason I think that there's 2 reasons why this is important. One of which is for people to have the visibility to see what is possible for them, and to be able to opt in so that employers can find them. And this would include people who maybe don't have social capital. Their mom's not going to help them get an internship at the local, company or doctor's office. So how can you become more visible without social capital? So that's one really important thing. The other important thing is that we need this data set to begin to put together really that what I call the skills genome, we have to basically itemize skills down to each job role in order to make hiring, to fix what I would call the broken school to work pipeline. So there's a lot we can talk about that. I mean, I'll just give an example of why that's important. If we say that, I say in the book that industry certifications are probably the best hiring signal out there, short of a degree right now. In fact, in many cases, it's better than a degree because it's very specific to say, I know how to operate this piece of equipment. I know how to be a data security, network engineer. And you can take a test so that employers know, that you are certified to do that thing. And that's actually getting people hired. And so, when you think about how many jobs are those kinds of certifications available for, the answer is, maybe 25 to 30% of job roles. And even many of those, it's not a well-known credential or a validated credential. And if we could expand that universe, it would be a game changer for skills-based hiring.
So that's on the demand side, if you will.
Yeah.
You also, I think, make an important point about on the kind of supply side, if you will, on the college side of the equation, how, we've made some progress now in most courses. Faculty will tell you what the intended learning outcomes are. But your point is that learning outcomes is still at a level of generality that is not going to really solve the problem. And you particularly talk about Western Governors University, for example, and you might, I think it's funny. I mean, doing this book talk from Harvard, I think you and I both see a universe in which, the most important higher education institutions in the country, I hate to say it, are not Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, but for this new world we're moving in, it's Western Governors, it's Southern New Hampshire University, it's Arizona State University, and they, and WGU in particular, you might say a word about what so intrigues you
they've done,
about what
so I do a whole chapter on this idea of experience being like the new degree, and that's a little bit exaggerated to make the point, but it's this idea that particularly in an age of AI, that employers care more about the applicant having relevant job experience than they do in having a piece of paper that says I majored in psychology, and so universities like WGU are starting to figure out that at least, I show a continuum of models that are starting to emerge, and WGU is actually not as far along in this model as some of the others, but they're doing something very important, and they're doing it at scale because they've got, 150,000. I have the number in the book, but they have a lot of students. And what they're doing is something called a skills profile, where they have actually created what they call rich skill descriptors for every job role. And in fact, in the book, I describe how you can find it. It's called the Rich Skills Descriptor Skills Library. You can find it probably just by Googling it. And it isolates the skill sets for job roles and then uses those in the courses, even in gen ed courses, in order to contextualize, like, so if the person, the student, I give the example of someone might be wanting to go into HR and they're trying to figure out how their, English class connects. So the coaches, everybody at WGU has a coach, is helping them translate the job skills to the courses that they're taking. And they're actually naming the job skills in the course, the course catalog or the course, syllabus. I know because I struggle with this in my own course. I teach, and I would give myself, maybe a B- in my own ability to try to convert my learning outcomes to skills, that people would find on a job description if they went to apply for a job. So I actually ran a sort of a test near the end of my class this past semester, where I asked, I put up, I did a survey, of like, I put all the job skills that I found on human-centered design, job descriptions, and then asked them how many of you feel like you could talk about this in an interview, or that you would even put it on your resume. I kind of did like a spectrum, and I didn't do very well. So it's a journey, right? Because it is hard to translate, because learning outcome is about is broader and more more academic.
Yeah.
Understandably, in a job description, it's very action oriented and results oriented, right? And those two, it's hard to marry those two constructs.
Let's come back to the experience question, because this is this is a big dilemma. It's this kind of conundrum where, even the reason that more than half of four-year college graduates find themselves underemployed a year after they graduate. This comes from a report from two organizations that Kathleen and I both know and respect, the Burning Glass Institute and Strata Education. But the reason for that, I would argue, is that most students do not understand that you need to build a resume as you're moving along, that showing up, with a four-year degree in almost any subject is not good enough, because the employer's first questions always are, first, what's your experience? So the question is, how do we get to a kind of an experience first kind of a model that really addresses that? Interestingly, in this report called Talent Disrupted, the two things that seem to make the difference between those who graduate and are put on or are employed in jobs that really did require a college degree and are on a path to sort of upward mobility. Two things. The first one you would guess, which is it makes a difference what you major in and the original labor market. But the second one really is experience, and and the best kind of proxy for experience is internship.
Right.
And there's a big difference between those who've had one or more internships, particularly in the field in which they're trying to get employed, versus those who don't. But even that's kind of insufficient. So the question that you wrestle with, Kathleen, and you might talk about that, is how do we shift to a kind of experience first, if you will, kind of approach?
Right. Because the other thing that I see bubbling up or bubbling beneath the surface is almost like a resentment between like the liberal arts majors and the more technical majors. I mean, because I had all of them in my honors class this fall, and they actually chose this topic that you just asked about to be their big design sprint. And the history majors and the psychology majors were really pretty bitter that, they couldn't get internships because what were they supposed to get them in, right? They didn't have employers knocking on their door like the cyber majors did. And so that, it really brought it home to me that, wow, how do we help particularly the broader liberal arts majors? And so I profile a couple of books, a couple of colleges in the book. I mentioned that WGU was working on the issue from the vantage point of having this fabulous skills library. Other colleges, I mean, obviously the granddaddy of all is down the street from Harvard, is Northeastern University in terms of experience, right? So they have been able to, catapult themselves into elite status pretty much because of their co-op model, right? Where you go to the college, like for the first year, then you get placed in a relevant apprenticeship, basically, and you leave college, you disenroll, you go to your apprenticeship for 6 months, and then you come back. And they're supposed to do two of these. And wow, I mean, parents love it, the students love it, employers love it, right? These people, I mean, they have they're in the 90th percentile for people getting hired into their field after college. So, okay, why don't more colleges do that? Well, it is really hard, as we unpack that story in the book about how they have had to hire like 250 employer engagement specialists, right? So it's not for the faint-hearted, but there are many models in between, or you can sort of try to get there. But this idea of baking apprenticeship into the 4-year degree is my favorite, and I've tried to do a couple of design sprints on this, and it's really difficult mainly because of the funding models and there aren't enough employers to go around. Those are the two big issues. But then there are schools like University of North Dakota, which are trying to tackle it in a smaller way, right? Which is to partner with some of these groups like Ripen. I don't know if you've heard of Ripen. There's also Parker Dewey is another one, but they are internship or sorry, actually more like work experience platforms. They also do internships, but it's the idea that a professor can partner with the platform and find, basically jobs to be done from, startups or companies, and weave work projects into the assignment, into the course. It's a fair amount of work for the professor, but I think that's a great model for giving students actual experience, not just, a simulated project, which a lot of us, have to, fall back on. But let me just say one more thing kind of in closing to this point, which is that my, overwhelming design principle that, that I think is the most important kind of mental model for colleges to think about is this idea of a stepladder approach, right?
Yeah.
This idea that you should be able to come in and out of college and even late high school. Late high schools are, I profile some high schools that are getting involved in this too, using CTE, career and technical education. But why can't you come in and out of high school and in more of a weave model, particularly for people who need earnings power to pay for college? It makes a lot of sense, which is actually, more than half of students are working their way through college. So it's a great way to try to do that, to try to weave increasingly career-related work into your learning path. And
I think the important point there is career-related work, because I think for an awful lot of students, their work life and their college life are in competition with one another rather than complementing, because the job that they have is to pay the rent basically.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. That also obviously leads us to apprenticeship, which is one model, at least, where in some fields, and again, I think of Ryan Craig's book on apprenticeship, which I know you reference in the in your book, where his what we're seeing, particularly in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, the demand in the healthcare field is so enormous that we are having hospitals that are basically hiring people first, then training them, and then deploying them. And that's Ryan's model, is kind of hire, train, deploy. And I think that apprenticeship, in a sense, is is based on that idea of you're putting people into a workplace, they're getting paid, and they're getting aligned classroom instruction as they move along, and they're getting a meaningful credential. And in a lot of places, and this is where community colleges come in particular, we're seeing kind of partnerships where at the end of the day, the education side of your apprenticeship is happening in a community college, and you're getting both a community college 2-year degree and you're getting the apprenticeship certification. So you've got kind of a credential of double value, if you will. And the still small numbers here, but I know it's something that you at least see, as we do, at least have the potential for significant, expansion. I mean, I think throughout your book, you're very focused on this challenge of scale with quality. And it just seems to me that's a sort of a recurring, kind of challenge and theme. One of the most intriguing things that, it's something that I've kind of wrestled with also, which is there a way that we can actually redefine college so that these, certifications, where obviously colleges now offer post-secondary certificates, and that's in terms of the what's the most rapid growing area in colleges? It's actually certificates first,
Right.
and then associate's degrees, and then four-year degrees, which
Right,
are
correct.
stalled at this point, which tells you that how the market is, is changing. But talk a bit about, this vision you have of colleges ultimately moving into a kind of brokering role. And well, I'll say more about that. Or, yeah.
Absolutely, because when some people hear that we want to redefine college, they think we mean let's dumb it down. And I don't mean that at all. I feel like the degree is one product that colleges should offer. And there are many others, right? And so if you think of college as the umbrella, and there being an array of products that serve different people's needs at different times in their lives, that's the model I feel we need to move to. The issue is many policy folks maybe in the room would get immediately, is that only the degree is funded at this sort of level, at the level, and I give the numbers in the book of the disparity between like the federal financial aid system versus the money available to do anything else. I mean, if you are a 18-year-old and you're going off to college and you're from a middle class family and you don't know what you want to study, you are funded through subsidies and loan subsidies as well. If you are a single mom who decides you want to get let's say a cloud engineering certificate to get on the ladder to a middle skills job, but you're looking for a short-term program, you're in most places you're on your own. And so, what's wrong with that picture? It's really about your circumstances and, either time poverty or financial concerns is what's making your decision. And why are both those people not afforded the same support? And because without the financial support, it also means that the short-term programs often are not evaluated. And so it's sort of the Wild West. You don't know about quality, and they can't scale, which is the point I make in the book. I mean, boot camps. So I have a daughter who didn't go to college, and she used a boot camp, later in life, like in her later 20s, to help, kind of springboard her into the digital marketing field. And it worked. $3,700. We paid half of it. She paid half of it. It was a General Assembly. I tell the story in the book. But actually, those boot camps are starting to decline in terms of consumer-facing boot camps because they haven't been able to scale, because they don't have access to the funding that the government funding that college does. So why can't boot camps? Why can't short-term certificates? Why can't apprenticeships? They also are really struggling to scale. Why can't those all be part of the college umbrella? And even programs like Year Up, which I talk about in the book, Year Up, being a nonprofit that is fully relies on philanthropy to create a really great short-term program to help people get to onto a professional job ladder.
Yeah, Year Up's interesting because they also have built partnerships with community colleges.
Right.
And they have very strong relationships with employers. I mean, that's their secret sauce in a way.
Yeah.
It's the challenge that the rest of us kind of struggle with. It's probably worth mentioning. I know you mentioned this in the book as well. We're all kind of waiting, hoping that the next Congress will get around to passing legislation to support the use of Pell Grants for short-term programs. And there seems to be a pretty broad bipartisan support around this idea. And as you point out, that would be a significant game changer. You talk about three front doors at the end of the sort of your kind of design thinking about this. And with colleges as they exist being one. And by the way, we might actually give you a chance to answer the question of your title is who needs college anymore? It's not nobody.
Mhm.
And actually, one of the interesting things about the book is that Kathleen creates what she calls kind of 4 personas, 4 types, if you want to call it that, of the types of students who she believes will continue to opt for the 4-year college route. And then another set of personas for those for whom clearly the 4-year route is not the likeliest route. But I think it is important to acknowledge that yes, colleges will continue, and
Mhm, mhm.
yes, there will be some people for whom this remains the best choice. But I think the overall, well, talk about the other 2 front doors,
Right.
because I think
Well,
that's
and I also, yeah, so I see colleges as sort of hanging on to in their current, the degree model,
yeah,
hang that they'll be able to sort of hang on to maybe, 30% of the market share. And that's like a broad, just a broad brush idea to think about how big these different, front doors will be. But so the question is, how are people going to access and utilize higher education? So traditional colleges, I feel, will still be there, but they will also service what I argue is the other 2 front doors. The biggest one over time, I think, will be what I call national platforms. And this includes some of the colleges that you mentioned earlier that are kind of serving a bigger and bigger group of people. They're growing. And this is, WGU, Western Governors University, Southern New Hampshire, but also some of the state universities like ASU, Arizona State, Purdue. And they're growing by offering what I described, which is a growing number of products and services, not just the degree. And they'll be joined, and this maybe is going to be a little concerning to some folks, understandably. I mean, I'm worried myself by potentially groups like Amazon entering the fray. Amazon actually runs the largest program outside the military for its own workforce to kind of earn short-term credentials and an earn and learn model, which is really fabulous. I
yeah.
credit them for it. They are not far off from being able to offer that to everyone in the way that they've come into the pharmacy market, let's say, or many other markets. And then there's also groups like Coursera that fit into that category, which are partnering with colleges, but they're also offering stuff on their own, like Google certificates, and they're unbundling higher education and offering it as a shopping cart kind of set of service or set of products. So I think that's going to be maybe 50% of the market. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20% of the market is going to remain and need to be supported by government, I argue, but also by philanthropy to support the folks that it's what I call it takes a village model, where you're going to have still have people who won't want to access or can't access either of those other 2 front doors. And how do we keep them? How do we service them with both the career services, the cohort model, and those are programs like Year Up, and I profile a couple of local ones in that are springing up in different places that I think are really that model is crucial for the folks who are left would otherwise be left behind.
So a last question for me before we bring Molly back in and open up for folks to ask their own questions. It's a small question, Kathleen, but how do we get from here to there? Where's the leadership going to come from? Who needs to step up? You've laid out this vision. You point out to a lot of really interesting work going on at the local level, state level, national level. But how do we create a movement out of this?
Well, I believe that particularly in this administration, that states is kind of
Yes.
where the action
Yeah.
is, and that's partly by design, right? But partly because there's too much chaos going on at the federal level. I think that that state leaders, whether they're higher education leaders in states or even consortia. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Colorado in the book and in researching the book. I think that is a great they have a number of the types of players from the career-wise, the apprenticeship organization that sort of started there in the U.S. To work that the governor's doing. There are a lot of the It Takes a Village groups. The lab is working, the Education Design Lab is working with all the community colleges on micro pathways which are basically the step-ladder approach. We're doing it at a state level, and the lab is working with 4 or 5 other states as well. And so that's where I'm the most excited. Is at the state level. And also community colleges, I think, are the most natural partner for states to do this work. As you say in your book, and I say in mine, community colleges can really step up and be the broker across all of the other stakeholders.
Yeah, we both, I think, see the world the same way. The community colleges at their best are the most entrepreneurial, market-oriented institutions in the higher ed landscape, and the best of them really understand the importance of kind of
and let me just
themselves.
Mention that the lab just announced, like last week, or a cohort of leading community colleges to do this transformation work that I'm very excited about. It's meant to help everyone, but it's like let's lean in with several organizations that can kind of help name the things that need to be done.
The one thing I would add, and then we'll open up on this question of leadership, is, I mean, ultimately, we need the big employer associations to really step up here. I think it's hard to imagine. I mean, there's got to be a stronger pull from the demand side, if you will. And I think we all struggle with this. But
that is true.
I think that's, at least to me, that's, if you ask what's the biggest difference between the US and places like Switzerland and Germany, it is, it is the role that employer organizations and associations play. And I see this as really, what they're doing is acting in their own economic self-interest, trying to figure out how do we intervene early enough in the system to make sure that each of our sectors is getting its fair share of the next generation talent pool. And that's a culture shift that has to happen. And I think Colorado is probably, I would agree, I think they're probably further along in this work when you look at, all pieces of their system, but they do have active, engaged employers. They've had good political leadership, and it's going to take a combination of those things. Molly, back to you.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. My video may be turned off at this point, but I'm happy to jump in with a question from the audience. This is a great one, and this may take a little bit of time to unpack too. Someone asks, can there be an overemphasis on career readiness? At the K-12 level, science education is almost entirely focused on preparing students for college and careers, almost no attention to preparing voters, consumers, or vaccinations, how to find trustworthy information. Is career readiness the be-all and end-all?
I'll jump in on that. Yeah, so I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I do spend time, particularly near the end of the book, talking about the unintended consequences of trying to service the needs of learners and employers, right? Because learners that are, over time, we've seen the reasons people give for why they go to college have really shifted towards to get a good job, away from the things that the questioner mentioned. And so how do you keep that balance? I mean, I think it's really hard as we move to just-in-time learning to think about what are the things we lose that aren't just-in-time, learning outcomes. And so one of the things that, and this may sound like a small piece, but one of the things that I know we've tried to do at the lab is how do we basically credentialize the kinds of things you would get in a liberal arts degree. I mean, we may not, like, we've created basically micro credentials around things like critical thinking, collaboration, empathy, cross-cultural competency, those kinds of topics. And we have pushed the 100 and some odd colleges that are doing these micro pathways. We've pushed them to include at least one of those micro credentials into their their stack that they put into their 6-month to 1-year program. And that's it's a small thing, but it's sort of a nod in the direction of kind of saving general ed in this move towards just-in-time learning. So the other thing that I say, one of my design principles at the end of the book, is that colleges, particularly expensive colleges, need to figure out how to offer their college experience and their sort of wonderful cohort coming of age experiences in let's say, they need a less expensive version of it, because people aren't, when they look at the value proposition of getting a job and becoming a better citizen of the world, the thing they're going to give up is becoming a better citizen of the world, because they don't see how it directly relates to getting hired. And that's going to happen over time as we unbundle college. So we have to offer it in smaller chunks, if that makes sense. And I know that sounds, it sounds heartless, but I try to be really practical in the book.
I think that this has big implications for the K-12 system, frankly. I mean, historically, we've thought that there were 3 main principles of particularly high school education. One was academic, one was career, and the third was civic. And I do think that, and it's funny, when I started, in this work, I felt it was the academic purposes were overwhelming the other 2. I was focused on careers, and so we jumped hard on I think of this as a seesaw. We jumped really hard on the other side of the seesaw to try to get a better balance between the career purposes and the narrowly academic purposes. And I think we now have helped shift the conversation. Everybody, I think now, at least at the policy level, says it's no longer college or career. It's got to be both. But the price that we've paid is insufficient attention to the civic purposes of education, and I think that's something that all of us have to address. We're now reaping the consequences nationally of inattention to the civic purposes of education. Next
one of them, I should just mention, one of the micro credentials that we created was called fake news, which was basically helping students, discern between factual and propaganda.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. This one connects back to your point about digital transcripts, skills wallets. This person's commenting and asking about how can the organizational culture of colleges be transformed by using AI? So I guess I'll add, how can colleges reorganize using technology to be more aligned with your vision for student success?
Well, certainly, when we started asking colleges to, skillitize their learning outcomes, we started asking that maybe five years ago, the colleges that the lab works with, and we recognized that it was an awesome task, and like a hand, they would have to do it by hand, basically, right? And people were doing it in spreadsheets, and now, AI does make that a lot easier. It may not be perfect, but at least your first couple of rounds or first couple of passes can be, and there's various tools that, the lab and others have come forward with using AI. So that's one piece in terms of moving us to an AI enabled world in terms of skills. The other thing to think about, though, is how AI is really helping learners, like with their resumes. It's helping them skillitize their resumes, right? Which is very helpful. But the problem that I'm hearing from, I was just with an employer last week who said, "Oh my God, it's a nightmare," because every applicant for like their software engineer jobs, all the resumes look the same, because everyone's using, the AI agent. And so now you need a different point of differentiation. They're getting a lot more, and they all look the same. And so, we have to figure out, and this is why I'm on the experience train and really saying, okay, you've got to have experience, because that's going to set you apart. AI can't fake that unless you're lying about it. So those are kind of two things where I think AI is impacting the conversation we're having.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you so much. Those are the questions that we had, and I think we're also just about at time. So
Great.
thank you both. I don't know if Mayan from Gutman will jump back in at this point just to take us home, but this is a fantastic conversation.
Well, I also just want to, if I could plug, if anyone who is in the Harvard community, I'll be doing an in-person book talk there on the 31st at the Kennedy School. I'm an alum of the Kennedy School with Matt Siegelman, who is the head of the Brennan Glass Institute, Gerald Chertavian, who is the founder of Year Up, and Peter Blair, the Ed School's own Peter Blair. So that's on the 31st at 4 o'clock for anyone who's local.
Great.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.